Anyway, I'd like to start by quoting just 3 words from one of my favorite authors, Gustave Flaubert. These 3 words are read to live, to which we might add a further word, well, so read to live well. But what does this mean, and why should policymakers and politicians care, let alone the general public? Let's begin with an expanded statement of the proposition updated for the 21st century. It's self-evident to us that literacy, from basic decoding to the higher order skills of critical literacy, is essential to modern participatory democracy. Why? Because the word unlocks human potential and is the primary means by which humans learn, discern, expand themselves, contribute to society, and thrive. There is also a wealth of evidence that shows it is one of the most effective ways to break the poverty cycle. Reading and writing well are fundamental to human agency, just as an informed citizenry is vital to democracy. In this way, reading and writing well is synonymous with living well. These are powerfully true statements, I think, but while policymakers might certainly ascribe to them in theory, they may not necessarily act on them, as we can see in Europe with the absence of consistent policies around breeding promotion. And as we've all learned through our own efforts at combating illiteracy, the task of influencing policy at a national level is a complex one, since what we must speak of is not an easily relatable proposition like sport, but rather the space where socio-economics, education, culture, and productivity meet. This demands multifaceted policy responses by government which must be delivered coherently and consistently over time in order to have a determining effect, something which, ironically enough, democracies are not particularly good at doing. Policies and governments continually change, and each change of administration brings with it changes in prioritization and policy direction. Furthermore, multifaceted policy responses require cooperation and coordination across different government departments. It sounds great in theory, but government departments don't necessarily like cooperating and are often reluctant to give up budget. In such a scenario, one has to think carefully not only about what will make an impression on policymakers by way of arguments and evidence, but what will actually prompt action. There are a few things, I believe, that can help us here. The first is marshalling evidence that points at the financial costs to the state of not acting. In essence, one is proceeding from a softer cultural argument to one which demonstrates the socio-economic consequences of illiteracy. The second argument is a logical consequence of the first, that the state gets far better value and far greater impact from preventative spending than it does from palliative spending. Preventative spending represents a fraction of the costs of dealing with later consequences of illiteracy, which the state then has to address and pay for to the tune of many billions. The third argument consists in showing that the cost of illiteracy do not just involve all of that. There is also a considerable cost that comes from the loss of productivity, be that social, economic, or cultural, that is a direct consequence of an individual's illiteracy. This is particularly relevant to European economies, which have moved from manufacturing to services to now what is called a knowledge or information economy. The fourth argument is a little more equivocal. It is simply that a healthy democracy depends on a properly informed electorate, an equation that is in crisis. This is only equivocal because, as we saw in Britain during the Brexit referendum, politicians may often invite an electorate to exercise its democratic right to vote, but they do not necessarily want that vote to be properly informed because that would not suit their political purposes. I'll have more to say about that in a minute, since it relates to the state's historical attitude towards literacy. But for the moment, let's also acknowledge the other side of the coin, which is that policymakers also realize, obviously, that in a digital age where nearly everyone can publish, the only remedy against the chaos of disinformation, disinformation and division is a critically literate electorate. Finally, it's worth noting that governments rarely act without compelling data and evidence. Sources will include one's own data, data from academic and longitudinal studies, data from partner organisations, but also research that is carried out by the government itself, which then can be quoted back to it. Here's an example from a recently published Scottish Government report. This found that the percentage of children with language development concerns increases in local authority areas that have a higher percentage of deprived communities. This information can be used in a variety of ways. It makes the link between poverty, poor language development, and illiteracy explicit, but it also allows us to propose policy and programme interventions that are targeted in geographically and demographically specific ways. Here's another example. I often point out to civil servants and politicians in Scotland that 6,000 people with poor literacy skills costs the state over £1 billion annually. These are the 80% of Scotland's prison population who have a reading comprehension age of 11 or under. For many, literacy leads to prison. Some other quick examples. Children from disadvantaged backgrounds face spending 24 more years in poor health than their advantaged peers, alongside increased likelihood of experiencing mental ill health. This allows you to show the forward cost of the state and the cost from lack of productivity. Growing up in Scotland, a longitudinal study found that frequent reading at home is one of only 3 factors proven to have an impact on the gap in expressive language between the most and least well-off children, an impact which occurs regardless of the parent's level of education. Pupils who read for pleasure do better in other areas of learning too, including maths, financial skills, and critical literacy. And those with poor vocabulary skills at age 5 are twice as likely to be unemployed by the time they are 34, and those who read for pleasure at age 16 are more likely to be in a professional or managerial job by the age of 33. Finally, there is PISA and other assessment programs which can be used to demonstrate the need for increased investment in literacy in all its forms and stages, since the optics of falling down national league tables are bad for sitting governments. This is the current case in Scotland, where PISA also found that over 70% of girls and 80% of boys said, at 15 years old, I don't read, or I read less than 30 minutes a day. Data from PISA is incredibly useful, but often the ways in which it is reported on and talked about isn't. Because for me, the single most salient fact is that despite many initiatives over the last 30 years, illiteracy rates across the British Isles have remained roughly the same at around 20 to 25% of the population. In this sense, tracking variations in PISA results and obsessing, as politicians and the media do, over national league tables is to pay attention to the wrong thing. What ought to be paramount is attention to the persistent underlying correlation between poverty rates, rates of illiteracy, and poor educational attainment, with all the future consequences for the individual, for communities, and for the state that I've just indicated. And it's precisely in these deprived communities where coordinated, multifaceted policy interventions need to be delivered as the only effective way of creating lasting change. A seminal report by Professors Sosu and Ellis, published by the Roundtree Foundation a number of years ago, expresses this. It finds that the kinds of programs we offer are, of course, effective and beneficial, but it also finds that the real long-term solution to illiteracy in deprived communities is to provide parents with jobs. There was a time when Britain still had an industrial manufacturing base, when working class culture flourished because there was an economy to sustain it. That culture included self-help, a focus on education, and the creation of associations and clubs of benefit to those communities. That culture was also politically conscious and politically literate because it had access to libraries and through them to education and ideas. Let's contrast that with today. New research conducted by Scottish Book Trust in partnership with the National Library of Scotland and the Scottish Library and Information Council paints a sorry picture. Between 2015 and 2021, Scotland librarian numbers were cut by at least 32%. 1 in 3 librarians reported that their whole service is at risk of reduction, and 82% reported a restriction on their funding and resources. That is little short of a disaster. Libraries are beacons of light, illuminating communities and individuals through all that they freely offer by way of books, information, learning, and entertainment. They are lighthouses in the dark. Without libraries, there is little hope of creating a better, more equal, and more informed society. The librarian and information professional is a vital guide in our information-saturated age, and yet the trend has been towards disinvestment in this service. But the state's historical attitude towards literacy and access to information has always been slightly equivocal. Right from the beginning of script in Mesopotamia over 5,000 years ago, we find scribes concluding their accounts with the words, "Let the wise instruct the wise, that the foolish may not see." Literacy at this stage was a jealously guarded power of the state, and as we see throughout history, which is itself an invention of script, any attempt to extirpate a culture involves, as it did in Scotland with Gaelic, for instance, a concerted effort to destroy the language and the script in question, both legislatively and through violence. And in Britain, this equivocation continued. For instance, even though the British government passed the Public Libraries Act in 1850, what really preoccupied politicians and industrialists during the late 1800s and the earlier 20th century was the theory of Taylorism, which, amongst other things, was concerned with the question of how you could educate working people just enough to operate heavy machinery, but not enough to engage critically with ideas, especially political ones. In other words, functional literacy, fine. Critical literacy, no thank you. This perhaps provides some context to one of the principal challenges modern democracies face today, that of language and truth, in an era where disinformation threatens to overwhelm fact and where complexity is radically foreshortened by simplistic populist tropes. The state has lost control of texts and ideas before with the invention of portable type, but now it has lost control again through an analogous revolution, that of the digital age, where everyone can become a publisher. Here, the stakes for the individual, for the communities and minorities, and for the political consensus we have formed around the ideas and practice of democratic society are much higher. Plato argued that writing destroys memory by replacing it. Today, we might argue that social media destroys not only memory, but the very idea of what authentic knowledge represents. In an everyday sense, the tide of opinion and claim has become a tsunami we struggle to parse. Truth, as such, can be digitally generated, altered, and transmitted in an instant to a million minds. And this is a problem, since we know from history that people are susceptible to propaganda, often failing to understand the agenda it serves, whether that is political with a big or small p. The net effect of this is what we see today, societies and communities that are polarized by claims to truth which are radically simplified and truncated, and which lead in turn to actions or reactions which provide no real solution at all. A quick illustration of the kind of thing I mean, a literary illustration. Over the past few weeks, 2 major British literary festivals at Hay and in Edinburgh have been forced by campaigners to end their highly lucrative sponsor relationships with a well-known financial institution, because that institution has 2% of its overall funds invested in fossil fuels. The literary community has been polarized by this, with writers on one or other side of the argument, just as arts workers are also divided. The fact that this financial institution actually has far greater investments in green technologies than in fossil fuels is apparently of no relevance at all. Nor have campaigners addressed the issue of how it is possible to live in a globalized economy without being in some way compromised, as they themselves surely are. And yet they have been successful in disrupting and financially crippling 2 of the most high-profile literary showcases in the UK. In such a scenario, critical literacy, which one might also call the memory of complexity, becomes the guardian of healthy and informed thought, providing a means of analytic rebuke to single-issue politics and narrow campaigning. And the memory of complexity is simply this: the perception gained through an engagement with literature, thought and knowledge that human beings are contradictory, various and complex, and that things are usually far more complicated and nuanced than they might at first seem. Instead of rushing to judgment, we use the skills gained from our reading to remind ourselves that this claim does not necessarily match that fact, and that those who serve up foreshortened truths are simply trying to make us serve a particular agenda. Promulgating and championing these critical and literate skills through the pleasures and benefits of reading is a large part of our job, and is, I think, one of the great tasks of the age. But it represents a considerable challenge because, as Carl Jung observed, thinking is difficult. That's why most people judge. Nevertheless, we have various tools we can use to make a difference, including, as I've mentioned, well-informed advocacy to policymakers, the effective marshalling of socio-economic evidence that is selected to address the preoccupations of policymakers, and a good strategic sense of how to deliver policy and make a difference through promoting the advantages of reading. Finally, let us not forget the moral force we bring in speaking on behalf of other people, and in reminding politicians of the heritage of what is ascribed right here in the complex layers of stone, architecture and art of this city, where the ideas and practices of democracy were first pioneered and then gifted to the world. It is ultimately for educators, with our help, to ensure that an individual becomes functionally literate, but it is for us to put the cultural superpower of critical discernment in their hands so that through reading they may live well. Thank you.